Hello everyone, welcome back. I'm Kris. So I don't know this channel. Oh, I can scroll, that's right. Sometimes I forget. This is Joe Scott. I don't think I've ever done this one. Why traveling in colonial America was super dangerous. Now the reason why I'm doing this is because of who he's doing this whole thing about. And that is during the American Revolutionary War, a pair of bandits known as the Harpes Brothers went on a vicious killing spree across the frontier. They are considered America's first serial killers. And they did all of this during the American Civil War. There is a place in southern Illinois called Cave in Rock that I'm going to go visit, I think in November. And I'll do a short, but I'm going to go to a couple places in November. I'm going to go to Daniel Boone National Forest and look at his grave. Well, visit the grave. I'm going to St. Louis, visit the grave of William Tecumseh Sherman. I'm going to go to Cahokia Mounds, which is somewhere around here. It's predates about the year 1000. And up to about 40 to 70,000 people lived in this giant thing. It was larger than London and Paris at the time. And they built these giant mounds of earthworks, and there was 120 of them. There's 80 of them remaining. But on one of them where the chief lived, you could stand on there and see the arches of St. Louis, the Arch of St. Louis, like 10 miles away. So I'm going to go there. Cave in Rock is another one, but now Harpes Head Road. Cave in Rock is a place where these guys went to. But I'm not going to say much more. Let's go ahead and get into the video. If you don't know about the Harpes Brothers, I know a little bit. They weren't friendly. They weren't pleasant.
Near Dixon, Kentucky is a junction in the road where U.S. Highway 41 meets State Highway 56. It's labeled on the map as Harpes Head Road State Historic Site. Its name hints at one of the most notorious crime sprees in U.S. history, bred from the very war that created the country as we know it. This is the story of the Harpes Brothers, America's first serial killers. Before we begin, I want to give a quick warning that we're going to be talking about some pretty nasty stuff in this video. In fact, it'll be a miracle this video doesn't get demonetized. Don't think just because we're talking about historical events that it's somehow tamer or more sanitized because it was a simpler time or whatever. If anything, it's the opposite. I'm just saying, I know some of you guys watch my videos with your kids.
Sorry, my dogs were fighting, so I was having to take care of that.
Kids, this may be one of those episodes where you just want to send them to the other room. Put a different video on for them. Here, I'll link to a video about smart animals. That's cute. Are they gone? Okay, let's begin. First, let's set the scene. It's the late 1700s. The United States as we know it doesn't really exist yet. Tensions between the colonies and the British Empire are at an all-time high. Protests broke out in multiple cities. In 1770, the British troops fired on a group of protesters in Boston, killing 3 on the spot. 2 more died later on from their wounds. This came to be known as the Boston Massacre. Although, like most things in history, the word massacre is a bit of an embellishment. The peaceful protesters were more like a drunken mob that descended on 9 redcoats who panicked and fired into the crowd. But, I mean, still, tension. 3 years later, the Boston Tea Party happened when protesters dumped more than 300 chests of British tea into the harbor to protest the Tea Act, which led to the most caffeinated fish of all time. All of this came to a head when fighting began in Lexington and Concord, setting off the American Revolutionary War in 1775. But just like the Boston Massacre wasn't quite as one-sided as we were brought up to believe, not everyone in the colonies were on board with the revolution. There were a lot of people who were doing just fine with the British and kind of wanted to stay with them. Like, think about how divided we are today, right? They were just as divided, but they were actually at war. Acts of violence broke out between neighbors on the different sides all the time. This was especially true on the frontier, which at the time were territories like Kentucky and Tennessee. So the idea of the frontier it's more of an abstract concept these days. There's nothing really today that you can compare it to. The frontier wasn't just unsettled wild land, it was kind of lawless. Every man for himself. There was no authority to go to if you got in trouble, and there were plenty of ways to get in trouble. roads were little more than well-worn Indian trails through overgrown forests where around every corner or behind every tree there could be a gang of bandits ready to rob you, or hostile natives ready to protect their land with violence. And it's in this violent, divided world that the Harpe brothers emerged. So another thing about this time period is this was a time of myths and legends like Johnny Appleseed and Daniel Boone, bigger-than-life heroes who tamed the wilderness and created a path for manifest destiny. But where you find bigger-than-life heroes, you'll also find bigger-than-life villains. And that was the Harpe brothers. So all of that is to say that it's a challenge to discern what is fact and what is legend in this story. These are events that took place over 200 years ago involving some pretty seriously shady dudes. So let's start with the story. The story is they grew up in a family of loyalists who sided with the crown. And things escalated to the point that one day a group of revolutionaries attacked their family and lynched their parents. The Harpe brothers then fled into the wilderness where they were taken in by an Indian tribe. The tribe taught them how to survive in the bush.
I can't move my thing, so apologies. You're just going to have to imagine, I guess.
And even more importantly, how to fight and kill like warriors. And after that, they spent the rest of their lives using those skills to take revenge against the entire human race, murdering anybody who came across their path and displaying cruelty beyond all human comprehension. That's the story. But there are a few problems with this story. First of all, the Harpe brothers weren't brothers at all. They were actually cousins. Both of their fathers were Scottish immigrants who settled in North Carolina, and they grew up together. Their names were Micaiah and Wiley Harpe, but they took on the nicknames Big and Little Harpe because, you know, one was bigger than the other. Not the most creative nicknames I've ever heard, but they got the job done. Micaiah Big Harpe was slightly older and obviously bigger. Contemporary accounts described him as a more impulsive and violent of the two, and he often used his size to get his way. Wiley Little Harpe was the brains of the duo, much more strategic and conniving, but just as ruthless. Now, as for the rest of their origin story, it's not known for sure whether their parents were actually murdered by revolutionaries, but as loyalists, they definitely had targets on their backs. And this tension and ostracism definitely would have shaped their attitudes toward the world as they grew up. And the bit about them being taken in by Indian tribes, again, it's hard to say if that really happened to them, but white settlers intermingled with Indian tribes all the time, especially on the frontier. In fact, I was just reading in a book about how a lot of the early colonists abandoned their European communities to go live with Indian communities because they preferred their way of life better. Like, especially in the Northeast, the Haudenosaunee tribes, the Five Nations tribes, were a lot more egalitarian and democratic than the Europeans that came over and were all obsessed with status and social class and whatnot. In fact, the argument's been made that those values of egalitarianism and democracy kind of rubbed off on those American colonists and gave them that streak for independence and democracy that led them toward the revolution. You know, I talked about the Boston Tea Party earlier. The people in the Boston Tea Party dressed up as Mohawk Indians because that represented a more democratic way of life that they wanted. But as I mentioned, some people were loyal to the British, and that's the side that the Harpe brothers were a part of. And as the revolution...
I thought they just dressed up like that so that they wouldn't be identified. That's what I'm going to stick to, because I don't think you're going to dress up like a native, because that's the system of government you want. If that was true, they wouldn't have booted them out. I got to disagree with them on that one.
Revolutionary War took hold, they joined a Tory gang in North Carolina and waged guerrilla warfare against Patriot colonists. That's one way of putting it. The other way of putting it is that the war gave them a good excuse to assault, steal, and murder people. Although they did actually join the British in a couple of battles, including the Battle of Blackstock in 1780 and Cowpens in 1781. And then the Americans defeated the British at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, and the war ended, meaning those colonial patriots that they'd been terrorizing and fighting against were now in charge. So they got the hell out of North Carolina and went west into Tennessee, which was just a territory at the time, mostly Indian country. By the way, that's another thing that the story of the Harpe brothers teaches us, is that, you know, the way we learn about American history is that we fought the war and then the war was over and everything was good, all was right with the world. But the truth is way messier than that. Like I said before, there were major fractures over the Revolutionary War, and those fractures didn't just disappear once the war was over. In fact, the violence of the war years only intensified the hostilities and reprisals. So yeah, they moved into Tennessee where they were out of the jurisdiction of the authorities. And they took with them a treaty.
Had the British won, it would have still happened. Just all the patriots, you know, the traitors, they would have probably been labeled. They would have had to deal with you know, payback, if not executed. So it would have went both ways.
Of women named Maria Davidson, Susan Wood, and Sarah Rice. Now, Again, details are fuzzy here, but some say that they were wives and accomplices of the Harpe brothers. Others say they were kidnapped. There is public record of Wiley Harpe marrying Sarah Rice, but apparently they all kind of shared the women. So either they were like a polyamorous Bonnie and Clyde situation, or they were two monsters with a harem of kidnapped victims. Either way, they went west and they hid out in the Cherokee Chickamauga village of Nickajack near modern-day Chattanooga for about 12 or 13 years. They ran a pig farm and earned a reputation as men that you didn't mess with, because they would not hesitate to murder you. I mean, the frontier was chock full of rogues and bandits hiding from authorities and preying on travelers and new settlers, but even amongst the bad guys, the Harpe brothers stood out. In fact, they weren't alone. They had a band of other outlaws with them, one of whom was a guy named Moses Doss. And maybe this gives some kind of clue as to what exactly their relationship was with the women, but at some point Moses became concerned for them. Perhaps he expressed his concern to them, maybe he threatened to take them to some authorities or something, but either way, they killed him. This is going to be a recurring theme. So by 1797, they were living in a cabin on Beavers Creek near Knoxville, Tennessee, and this is when something changed, and the Harpe brothers went on the move. One story is that people started noticing that their pig farm had seemed to have run out of pigs, but they also kept coming to market to sell pigs all the time. And simultaneously, probably unrelated, a lot of other people's pigs were going missing. And they'd probably been stealing pigs for a long time.
I just figured they were selling human meat.
But nobody wanted to mess with them. But in 1796, Tennessee became a state, meaning there was now some kind of law and order in the area. So yeah, it was time to hit the road. So in 1798, they set off on a trail of death and destruction across Illinois, Kentucky, and Tennessee that they are still known for to this day. And it all started with a man they met named Johnson at a bar, or a rowdy groggery, as they called it. So the story goes that they met the man and noticed that he had a nice full coin purse, and they convinced him to travel with them. Now this wasn't that unusual back then. Like I said, the roads were super dangerous, so people tended to travel in groups. So the Harpes convinced him that they could help keep him safe. And so they left together, and instead, they killed him and took his money. A passersby found his body floating in the Holston River a few days later. It had been ripped open and filled with stones, which kind of became a trademark of the Harpe brothers. They would fill the body cavity with stones and then dump it into a river to make it sink to the bottom. Which is kind of horrifying, because even with all the killings that we know about that they committed, there's probably tons more that we don't know about, because the bodies were never found. The Harpes then moved east toward the Cumberland Gap to meet up with their wives. They killed twice more while on the Wilderness Road. This time was a pair of travelers named Paca and Bates. The second time was a young man named Langford, but like their other victims, they didn't dispose of the body very well. Langford's body was found by a nearby innkeeper who recognized it, figuring out that it was the Harpes that committed it. With their rate of violence escalating, a posse formed and chased the Harpes, who were caught on Christmas Day in 1799. They were imprisoned in Stamford, Kentucky. Enough evidence was found for a trial in the District Court of Danville, Kentucky, but just before the trial date in March, the Harpes escaped. Some think with the help of their wives. In April, the Kentucky governor placed a $300 reward on each of their heads. It's about $7,000 in today's money. Now, one might think that they would consider that a bit too close for comfort and lay low for a while, but they didn't. They kept on killing people. They headed west, where they killed 2 more men on the trail, and then near the mouth of Saline Creek, they came across 3 men who were camping, and they joined them for some s'mores. I'm kidding, they killed them. They eventually found themselves at an area...
Yeah, Cave and Rock, that's where I'm gonna go. It won't be for another 4 months, though. Come on. All right. Ow!
They eventually found themselves at an area called Cave and Rock in southern Illinois, which was a stronghold of the river pirate Samuel Mason. Yeah, I mentioned the bands of bandits and robbers on the trails and stuff like that. Did I mention the river pirates? The Mason gang used the cave as a hideout, and from there they would attack supply boats heading up the Ohio River.
And Mason was a psychopath, from what I remember.
And this seemed to be as good a place as any for the Harpes to settle down for a while with their wives and 3 children. Oh yeah, they had some kids at this point. And this was a good fit for a while, but eventually the Harpes found a way to cause more trouble. Now, keep in mind, the Mason gang was one of the most brutal gang of pirates around, but even they saw the Harpes' brutality and were like, dude, chill. Because the Harpes apparently had a kick out of taking travelers up to the top of the bluff, stripping them naked, and then throwing them off the cliff. Like you do. So yeah, the Mason gang kicked them out. And this...
From what I remember hearing, they would throw them off the cliff, and they would land, not in the water, but on the rocks. And if you didn't die, they would come down from the rock, and then they would just lay next to you, and they'd be laughing and joking and maybe drinking. Meanwhile, you're there just suffering and slowly dying, and they're just watching you, and just because that was their enjoyment, just to watch you die, as you do back then, because there's no TV.
This really is what made the Harpes stand out. There were tons of thieves that would kill to protect themselves or to serve their own interests, but the Harpes, they killed for sport. They got off on it. Once they were dismissed from the Mason gang, they headed back into eastern Tennessee and continued their killing spree. In July 1798, they killed a farmer named Bradbury, a man named Hardin, and a boy named Coffee. More bodies were soon discovered. William Ballard was disemboweled and thrown into the Holston River. James Brassel had his throat slashed and found on Brassel's Knob. And John Graves and his teenage son, their heads were axed in south central Kentucky. And in Logan County, Kentucky, they killed a little girl, a young slave, and an entire family who were sleeping at a campsite. They also killed and disemboweled a man named Trowbridge in August. With the violence escalating and a bounty on their heads, they found themselves being chased by various posses. And in one close call, the posse was bearing down on them, and Big Harp's infant daughter started crying. And, the crying threatened to give them away, so he bashed her head against a tree.
Yep.
He would later confess genuine remorse for this. It's the only murder he ever claimed to feel bad about. But it was in the summer of 1799 when it all finally caught up to the Harpes brothers.
He, not to make it morbid, but I'm going to make it morbid. He grabbed the kid by the feet. And then, how can I give a good example? I don't have anything. Grab by the feet, swing it around, and that's what he did. Like a lasso, bashing the kid's head against a tree. So, Father of the Year, I hear you saying. I'm going to disagree.
They came upon the home of Moses Stiegel in Webster County, Kentucky, and purchased the room for the night. Actually, it was kind of tradition back then that if you had a home and there were travelers going through the frontier, it was tradition to put them up in your home. While there, they killed an overnight guest named Major William Love. The story is that they apparently had to share a room with Love. He was snoring a little too loud. So Big put an end to that. They then entered the kitchen and demanded that Miss Stiegel make them some food. She obliged, but then her 4-month-old boy started crying, and, well, we know how Big Harp dealt with crying babies. And when Mrs. Stiegel turned around and saw the sight of Big Harp cutting her son's throat and screamed, they killed her as well, and then burned the cabin down. This event would be the Harpes' undoing. When Moses Stiegel came home and saw what happened, he quickly found a posse, and vigilante justice was about to take hold. By the time Stiegel's posse caught up with them, they had already murdered 2 more men named Hudgens and Gilmore on the trail. As the posse closed in around their camp, Little escaped, but Big was chased down. They managed to shoot him once in the leg and once in the back.
I just want to say this was not the first posse. I believe there was a posse before this, and they knew kind of where they were. I would say they were within a mile or two, and they just chickened out. They thought, no, we're not going after them. They just kind of, I think they stopped at like the river or something, and they were like, well, they're across the river.
And as the legend has it, as he lay there bleeding out, he confessed to his killings to the men who stood over him waiting for him to die. That's when Moses Stiegel took Big's own butcher knife and cut off his head. According to the story, he did it while Big was still alive, and he did it as slowly as possible to extend the agony. Micaiah's last words were, quote, "You're a goddamn rough butcher, but cut on and be damned." Once it was over, Moses took Big's head and impaled it on the limb of a tree near the intersection of a local road to serve as a warning for other would-be bandits. That spot became known as Harpes Head Road, that I mentioned at the beginning of this video.
Oh.
But Little got away. He headed west again with the women and returned to the Mason gang at Cave in Rock, this time using the name John Seton. There, he managed to stay alive for another 4 years before his insatiable greed got the best of him. Turns out Mason had a $2,000 bounty on his head. That's about $50,000 today. So Little and another pirate turned on Mason and decapitated him. They took the head in for the reward money, and as they began to leave, a victim from an earlier riverboat attack recognized them. Authorities immediately arrested him, but he escaped again. Maybe his nickname should have maybe he should have stuck with Wiley. That would have been better than Little. But a posse did catch up with him, and he was finally brought to justice. Tried, sentenced, and hung to death. And just to make sure he was dead, they cut off his head as well and placed it on a spike near the Natchez Trace as a warning to other outlaws. This was the February of 1804, and their bloody spree of violence finally came to an end. The 3 women were arrested and tried, but the community actually took pity on them. Again, there's still debate around whether or not they were willing accomplices or kidnapped victims, but in this case, they were seen as victims, or they were able to convince people they were anyway. Perhaps a piece of evidence that helped convince the jury was the fact that that whole thing where Micaiah murdered his own child, apparently that happened several times. There were 3 children, between the 5 of them, that survived, but apparently they had several more children, all of which were dispatched in the interest of expediency. It's hard to imagine a woman willingly staying with somebody who does that to their children or actively participating in it. Of course, there are female psychopaths too. Regardless, the 3 of them went on to marry, raise families, and live the rest of their lives in peace. In the end, the Harpes claimed to have killed 39 people, but that number may be closer to 50 or higher. Like I said before, the way they disposed of bodies means that there could have been a lot more that nobody knew about. The Harpe name became synonymous with violence, lawlessness, and unspeakable evil. And many family members changed their last names to hide the fact that they were related to them. Some just dropped the E, while others changed their names significantly. In fact, there's a rumor that Wyatt Earp was a descendant of the Harpe brothers. Earp. But in a way, bear with me because this could get pretentious for just a second. Aren't we all descendants of the Harpe brothers? The United States, for all its positives, has always had a dark underbelly to it. Those tensions that were created in the fire of the Revolution, the tensions that created the Harpes, they're still around. They don't take the same form they used to. They've evolved over time, but they're still there, kind of woven into the fabric of our history. You know, we celebrate the great heroes from the Revolution, but we forget that the Revolution was messy and created fractures that led to unspeakable violence. There are similar fractures in society today. Fractures that manifest in evil and violent acts with relentless, overwhelming regularity. Am I working too hard on this?
Yeah. Wyatt Earp was born in Monmouth, Illinois. I want to visit his home. He was
Am I working too hard?
He worked downtown Peoria at one time in a brothel as security for his wife, who was a prostitute. He was her pimp / security. And then I think he beat a man almost to death, or he did kill a man for hurting his wife or not paying or robbing. I don't remember. And then he fled. He fled from there. I think he went to Dodge City, and that's when he became Wyatt Earp that we all know.
On this? I'm just saying that there are lessons to be learned from the Harpe brothers. This isn't just a salacious story about a couple of serial killers. They were serial killers formed by the very birth of this nation. Every rose has its thorn. You might even say every action has an equal and opposite reaction. That's science. Actually, that's classical mechanics, which you can learn more about with today's sponsor, Brilliant. So here's the deal. If you watch this channel, you probably enjoy learning. Maybe you struggle with the math and physics stuff in school. I know I did. The thing is, everybody learns in different ways, and the way we were taught in school...
Okay, it's just an ad. So we're going to end this here. So what'd you learn about the Harpe brothers? This was a very quick tale. That chapter... he has a podcast, and one of his first episodes is about the Harpes brothers. I think it's about an hour long. That's brutal. Goes into detail. Something civilization. Anyways, I'm going to end this here. And like and subscribe. And until next time, you have a good day. Have a good night.